November 1973, near Titusville in Florida. Paula Hamrick leaves her house. The young woman, aged 22, is a waitress in a restaurant in town, and this afternoon she's late, so she decides to hitchhike. At the time, it's something she and her friends do often. Little does she realize a few kilometers away, the driver of this car is a hunter, looking for prey. When the car stops alongside her, the young woman doesn't hesitate. Paula Hamrick will never reach her destination. She will die a terrible death. A little later, the man forces the young woman into a remote forest, where he shoots her with his rifle and then sordidly violates her body. The awful murder is the first in a series that will terrify Florida. The initial act of a bloody and perverse series the killer himself will describe. I killed that day because I wanted to. I may seem callous, but that's the way it was. In the weeks that follow, Florida will be confronted with one of the most gruesome killers America has ever known. People who cross the murderer's path, from policemen, lawyers, to family members and friends of the victims, and even those who narrowly escaped his clutches, bear witness to the hunt to bring the murderer to justice. A criminal saga narrated by the confessions of the killer himself. On the 25th of November 1973, the small, quiet town of Titusville is reeling in horror. In a nearby forest, a hiker has just uncovered the body of a young woman. A naked corpse, partially decomposed, hands tied behind her back. A horrific sight. The body of Paula Hamrick, the killer's first victim. She didn't realize I was going to kill her. In any case, she couldn't defend herself. She was tied up. Over the next few days, the local police mobilize. They aim to answer the question, who killed Paula Hamrick? They didn't realize that the series of killings was only just beginning. Who committed this atrocious crime, and for what reason? To the police, the decomposing body found in the wood is a mystery. Heading up the local county's criminal investigation is Todd Goodyear, a crime scene specialist. This police lieutenant is fully aware that at the time, the early 1970s, no one had any idea.
You know, we always say that the good part about working homicide is your victim can't lie to you because they can't talk. And in this case, this is your biggest piece of evidence that you have at that point in time is your scene, and your scene is basically what's here. You know, with a case like this, you're looking at probably somebody that knows the area, because first off, they have to find that place, and it'd be comfortable to be in there. If you're from out of town, you're not going to be comfortable there. If it's a little bit off the, off the roadway and that, they had to be comfortable with that area and probably know it. So I think it's somebody that either lives, works in that area.
The autopsy shows Paula was killed with a bullet to the head, and that the young woman had been raped, but after she was shot dead. But the police have nothing to go on. There's nothing suspicious about the victim's profile. Paula Hamrick was a young woman with a clean record. The police are at a complete loss.
People kill people for reasons. You know, there's money, there's love, there's greed, all those things, the reasons, passion, being mad at somebody. There's all those reasons to kill people. So if you find out who your victim is, it tends to lead you at least in the direction of a suspect. In this case, they were finding out their victim, and they said, oh, she left to walk from her house to her boyfriend's house, and she never got there. And she's not having problems in school, she gets along with her parents, you know, all those things. That, now you go, that's another one of those things where you, oh, this is not good. Because now, who's your suspect?
So far, there is no suspect. The officers in charge of the investigation are unaware a serial killer has moved into their district. It marks the start of a particularly complex hunt that will last several months. Brevard County, which includes Titusville, is large, more than 4,000 square kilometers. 500,000 people live there, and amongst them, there's a terrifying killer. Less than 2 weeks after the first murder, the man is on the road again. He drives around looking for young women or adolescents who are hitching a ride. Because the killer has decided to strike again.
That I would kill again? Yes, sir. The thing with the passion again is that when something begins to fill your every waking thought, it just completely took over. I was spending more and more time looking for opportunities.
In a residential area of Titusville, he comes across Nancy Jerry. She's just 18 years old and is on her way to a neighboring town to spend the evening with friends.
Picked up this girl, she was hitchhiking. She was going to she was a singer at a bar, and basically drew a weapon on her gun.
Once again, it's the same scenario.
And carried her out into the woods and then threw down on her and made her get out of the car, right? And then shot her.
Nancy Jerry's corpse will be found 10 days later. Because of the heat and humidity of Florida, it too is in a state of advanced decomposition. It makes the work of the detectives even harder. They can find barely any clue to act on. Forensic science is in its infancy. The inquiry reaches a dead end, but the number of victims is about to increase. A few days later, a new corpse is discovered a few hundred meters from the location of the first. The murder is particularly shocking and brutal. The victim is just 14 years old, virtually still a child. Her name is Sharon Wimmer. She too was shot in the head and then raped after she was murdered. Nancy Jerry, Paula Hamrick, Sharon Wimmer, 3 young hitchhikers, all apparently killed in the same manner. The murders are without doubt connected, and the police realize for the first time that a serial killer is on the prowl in their county.
Killers are creatures of habit, unless there's a reason for them to change. You know, we always look at MO, what's the method of operation, and everybody has one. So looking at the age of the victim, how they were taken, where they ended up, the area, how the bodies are left, how they were killed, yeah, it would be pretty easy to link this that you were looking at a serial killer at that time. That'd be one of those moments about the third body, you're going, this is not a good thing for us, this is going to be a problem.
But where is the serial killer hiding? It's the first such case in Florida. The police increase their efforts and their patrols. But the killer himself seems unconcerned by the extensive police activity. He believes himself above suspicion. He's a 20-year-old electrician with no criminal record, and incredibly, he's married with a baby daughter. Under this aura of respectability, there lurks a perverted serial killer that the police are desperate to arrest. His name is Bernard Giles. We met the murderer in his high-security prison in Florida. Considered one of the most perverse criminals of the last 40 years, Bernard Giles has never before agreed to an interview. Now he's willing to reveal everything about his murder spree and the reasons that drove him to become a serial killer.
No, I didn't wake up one morning and decide this is the day I'll commit a murder. It was basically a situation where things just came together.
In just a few months, Bernard Giles will turn out to be an implacable killer. By the end of 1973, he will have killed 3 times. After each of his murders, he returns home to his wife and daughter, as if nothing had happened.
This was at, about 5, 6 o'clock in the evening. Like I say, I brought my car home. My wife went to a night class. And I remember as soon as she left, I was just so happy. Or just, because that's who I was.
In his neighborhood, Bernard Giles is well thought of. Nobody could imagine such a quiet neighbor is in fact a murderer. Monique is French, originally from Orleans, but she's been living in Florida for 40 years. She used to see Bernard Giles almost every day.
He was pleasant. Never would we have ever thought he could have done such things. We were really surprised when we found out. He lived in that house over there with his wife and little girl.
A family in full bloom. Joanne, his wife, is 18. Little Heather is just 6 months old. They won't know until the last moment the true nature of Bernard Giles.
Joanne was very nice, very pretty. She had long black hair, very pleasant, a very nice young woman. And I used to tell her, you could be my daughter. And she was so pleased, to have a little girl.
Having a family, however, does not lay to rest the demons causing such ravages to Bernard Giles's mind.
Some people attempt to domesticate themselves, to settle themselves down by getting married. I'll get married and I'll get a job and everything will be good, right? That doesn't work. That's not how it works. It didn't work for me.
For several years, Monique rubbed shoulders with a killer. At the time, she saw the Gileses frequently. Sylvia, her daughter, was only a child, and today some bad memories make sense in retrospect.
That guy that lived across the street?
Yeah, but he used to work from there to go to his parents all the time.
Right.
And
I don't know, I was pretty young when I was young, so I really didn't ever know.
Well, you were about 9 years old when he was around, 8, 9 years old.
I remember vaguely, Philip and I were trick-or-treating, and we went to his house, and he was drawing a picture of this really pretty woman. Then all of a sudden he drew a snake around her face and around her neck.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden her head just exploded with blood, and he just scared us, and we thought that
it was just Halloween, but
it was Halloween, but I guess he was just really creepy.
Yeah, he was.
One memory that traumatized the 9-year-old girl. But no one who knew him would yet suspect his true nature.
I can never prove.
We used to go over there and watch TV or something, but yeah, we trusted him very well, and it was crazy, but like I said, if I had been older, I wouldn't have gotten in a car with him. And then I wouldn't be here.
During this period, their neighbor was constantly on the lookout for new victims. His macabre search gets closer and closer to home. Whenever he can, the predator scours the streets looking for young female hitchhikers. He has by now fine-tuned his tactics.
Generally speaking, you pick someone up hitchhiking, the first question is, where are you going? Right? They let you know. And essentially the reason you're asking that isn't to find out where they're going. It's to find out if you have enough time to take care of what you need to take care of. And you'd essentially draw a weapon and throw down on them, perhaps tie them up.
That day, he came across Krista Melton, a 17-year-old teenager. He uses the same method. He ties up the young woman in his car, takes her to a remote part of the woods, and shoots her dead with his rifle. he generally kills the victims from behind.
When I was fully into it, I was so hyped. So I mean, it was like, I've used the expression, you could almost see the atoms vibrating. I mean, just that alive. You do things because there are internal mechanisms that drive you in those directions. If you have a particular propensity towards something and you feed it and feed it and feed it, it becomes your expression.
Krista Melton becomes Bernard Giles' fourth victim.
I didn't collect trophies. There were people who take away the breasts, you know, stuff like that. None of that. It essentially just clean kills.
In the new year of 1974, Bernard Giles thinks he's invincible. He's killed 4 times. He doesn't know his victims, so nothing can tie him to the crimes. For the Serious Crime Police, the number of unresolved murders is increasing. 4 victims so far, and still no lead.
It wasn't a contest with the police. It wasn't nothing to do with that. And again, it was a situation where I wasn't doing my clearest thinking at that point in my life.
Having to deal with a serial killer for the first time, the investigators are out of their depth. How many times will the killer strike again? How many more victims before the killer makes a mistake? The discovery of the bodies of the young women has shocked the entire region. The papers are full of the news, and Titusville is gripped by fear. Everyone knows a killer is on the loose, and the question is, who will be the next victim? Back then, Nancy was a young mother. Like others, she understands how dangerous it could be, yet she still continues to hitchhike.
In the early 70s, it was fairly common because people didn't worry about those things then, about who would pick them up. I don't know, I never looked at it as anyone ever deserving anything like that. It's not something that ever crossed my mind.
The concept of a serial killer was still vague and something that only happened in the movies.
There wasn't a lot of news activity about things like that. And serial killers were, other than Charlie Manson going on in California, there wasn't a lot of experience with these things at that time. So it wasn't, I don't think they linked a lot of it, because I don't remember a lot about it on the news. Like now, you can turn on CNN and you can get the instant news, but back then you couldn't.
Nevertheless, the local authorities issue severe warnings about hitchhiking in the region. Some young women, however, continue to thumb a ride. It's good news for the killer, who is prowling for yet another victim. But the young women he picks up in his car do not all end up the same way.
I shot everyone I could. No, I'm serious. There aren't a lot of women who hitchhike. And I didn't shoot them all. Where you make the person an object of your fantasy. Okay. As long as that person stays in the role of an object, then you can work your fantasy around them. If they can engage you in some way and essentially bring enough of their humanity out there or that you no longer see them entirely as an object and begin to have some compassion on them. There have been women who have saved their lives that way.
To the police, the time to act has arrived. There's a sense of urgency in January 1974, when several local young women are reported missing. Investigators fear some might have become victims of the murderer. In an effort to resolve the case, they try to get the population involved in the search for any new bodies. Among the volunteer searchers is Robert Telfer, then aged 20, employed in the Attorney General's office.
That was really my involvement in the case, other than observing what was going on, being aware of the problems there were in the case at the time. And like I said, if the police called and wanted some assistance, well then, you know, I'd go out along with some others to try and help out.
It's the 10th of January 1974, and Robert is about to experience an event he will never forget. The police decide to inspect the areas where the first bodies were found with a fine-tooth comb, and Robert volunteers for the search a few kilometers north of Titusville, in this orange grove.
The day I went out, we had probably 8 or 10 people, I think, out doing it. They did devote a good deal of manpower, obviously, because this was a real threat to the community. People were really being frightened by this. I was riding with one of the police, and as we came down a road, it was a little more twisting than this, maybe not as wide.
The search will not be in vain. After several hours, Robert notices a light-colored stain in the tall grasses.
We could spot, basically we spotted the clump of hair in the skull off to the side. It was part of a skeleton. Some of the bones obviously had been scattered or carried off by animals, but the skull was there. The hair on the skull was remarkably preserved. I mean, that I remember quite vividly, because it surprised me. Everything else had deteriorated, but the hair was remarkably intact.
The corpse cannot be immediately identified, but it's the serial killer's 5th victim.
I only know a few names. I don't know their names, but I remember faces in general.
Robert Telfer is just 20, but he will help police identify the latest victim.
The crime scene people came up. They had a bag that they wanted me to hold, and so I held it, and they put the remains in that bag. There was some jewelry left at the scene. Initially, when we were looking, we just found the body. We wanted to see if there was some, identifying characteristic, or did we need to move on to some other victim's family. And the jewelry was, it was a necklace, pretty distinctive. Her siblings recognized it. The mother was a little more hesitant. She just didn't want to face the fact that her daughter had not been found alive.
The necklace finally allows the authorities to identify the body. Her name was Carolyn Bennett, age 17.
Oh, I still remember that quite well, because, you just don't go out and find a body and help the police and hold the bag and go to the family and that every day. I was a fairly new lawyer at that time. I hadn't really worked on a great number of cases, so yeah, that sticks out in your memory. Everybody was concerned about the women in the community who were being found dead. Yeah, those kind of things you don't forget.
Robert Telfer is unaware the murderer is about to strike for a 6th time the following day. This time, however, nothing goes to plan for the serial killer. Cocoa is a resort south of Titusville. On the 11th of January 1974, Darlene and Vicky, 2 15-year-olds, decide to skip school and spend the day on the beach. Despite the warnings to be extra careful, the girls decide to hitch a lift. I saw these 2 young girls and didn't hesitate for a second. They climbed in and they seemed happy that someone had finally stopped. By picking up 2 hitchhikers, the killer has changed his habits. Vicky is in the back. 37 years later, she can still recall every second of what was the most awful day of her life.
He was friendly, but not really, and you just had a feeling something just wasn't right. And I wanted to get out of that car, but we couldn't get out of the car, you know.
After a few kilometers, her fears are confirmed. The driver changes direction and produces a weapon from below his seat and threatens his 2 teenage passengers.
We thought he was like playing a bad joke at first, but it didn't take very long to realize he wasn't, you know. And he had he had everything in the car ready. I mean, he was prowling for people, so it was obvious. So then he told her to wrap my hands, and then he wrapped hers while he was driving. And then he went up into the woods, like in a little path type of thing. He already knew where he was going. It was obvious. And we get out of the car, and he starts leading us down this little path. So we go into the clearing, and he's like, makes us sit down, and he tells us to take our clothes off.
Basically, I was more interested in one victim than I was the other. And I had attempted to knock one of them unconscious. The gun went off.
Bernard Giles squeezes the trigger by accident. The shot flies harmlessly into space, and Vicky seizes the moment to make her getaway.
And when it did, I jumped up and I ran. And he had to reload because I heard him have to clip it, and I was well on my way, but I still heard it. And then he kind of sort of tried to come after me, but didn't.
She gets away. She's getting away. The other one's starting to get away. I knock her down, right? Kick her. And I basically now I got to get out of here. I got to get gone, right?
For the first time, the killer panics. He abandons the teenager and flees in his car.
I get in my car and I go back to my home. And I know I got to run. I know I've got to get somewhere.
Vicky runs through the woods. She understands she's narrowly escaped a terrible death, but doesn't know what happened to her friend, Darlene. She eventually informs the police.
I told them what happened, and they went looking for him. And they found her, but not him, because he had taken off.
Darlene and Vicky, the 2 teenagers, are in shock, but otherwise unharmed. The murderer returns home. Bernard Giles thinks he has enough time to leave the region the following morning. He doesn't realize he's already been identified.
Now they're gonna, what I didn't know was, I knew they had a description of me, a description of the car, but I didn't know they had my name, right? Which makes a big difference.
But Vicky had seen Bernard Giles's name in his car.
I had gotten his name from being in the back seat. Look, he had his books back there, and he has his name right on the books. So I was able to give his name.
The police head straight to the Gileses.
They got a description of the car, me, and the name, so they're basically waiting on me. By the time I get home, I come out, they arrest me.
Less than an hour after he tried to kill the 2 teenagers, Bernard Giles was arrested at home and taken to the police station.
I remember being like in this open room, and they brought him in there, right, like close, almost as close as you and I are, and asked me if I could identify him. And so I identified him right then, and then the rest is scared, really, really scared. I mean, even though I knew they had him, I didn't know if he would like try to get away from him and attack me or what, you know? So I was very scared.
Vicky's evidence is an unexpected break for the police. They finally have a suspect for the murders of 5 local young women.
You don't have a lot of evidence. You don't have a suspect that comes right to mind. I think in some cases they were probably feeling pretty lucky that they had a victim get away because they gave them a suspect, because it sounded like before that they didn't have a suspect.
The investigation is far from over. Giles is only suspected of murders that took place in recent months. He denies being the hitchhike killer. The police are concerned by Giles's profile. How could a young married father with no criminal record be the monster they've been hunting for so many weeks? Their challenge now is to prove that this apparently model citizen is indeed the serial killer. The investigators have to establish Bernard Giles's psychological profile and try to trap him. In Scottsmoor, they continue to question his neighbors. No one can understand it. They all knew Giles, the electrician. He had lived in the small town since the age of 5 and had grown up in the neighborhood with his parents and 4 brothers and sisters. The police consider Robin to be a key witness. He and Giles knew each other from a very young age. The police will begin to discover the real Bernard Giles, thanks largely to Robin's evidence.
Well, we grew up together. I mean, and my friends, we, hang out together, and, we always, get high and things, This was back when I was, teenager.
It was just smoking and drinking and stuff like that. But it was, when I was a teenager, I was very wild. A lot of partying, a lot of drugs, a lot of hard drugs. And
we found out, because, back when you used to do all mushrooms, everybody used to eat mushrooms or drink mushroom juice or whatever, but we found out he was running them up. And after that, we kind of split off from him or whatever, because he was getting weird on us.
Some indications of delinquent behavior, but nothing that would lead Robin to suspect he was socializing with a future murderer.
Like you say, you can't really look into a killer's mind. You don't know. You never know. You wouldn't think, just like me talking to you. You know what I'm saying? I would never think you would be a killer, would you? Okay. Well, that's what I thought. You'd never think that. It kind of fades away from you, you know what I'm saying? After years, it fades away. But when you bring it back like y'all doing right now, it's horrible.
What goes on inside the mind of a murderer? The police were trying to answer that question by investigating Bernard Giles. What they don't know yet is that Giles could have started killing a lot sooner. They are shocked when they later discover his urges to kill go back to when he was still a young child.
I have a very good memory. And my memories go all the way back. I can remember the actual incident whether I was sexually imprinted for violence, directed towards women. It was a situation, I was about 5 or 6 years old, and we were, little kids were playing a game. The name of the game was Kill the Witch, right? And I was play strangling, and I remember that as being my initial sexual rush,
Bernard Giles is certain the childish game was the turning point. Playing and strangling one of his playmates that day caused him so much pleasure that his life changed forever.
And it's my own personal belief that that's what fixed that in me and carried me down that road. That from then on, anytime I saw any type of sexual violence against a woman, or sexual violence, any violence against a woman, it became sexual for me.
Why did the game affect Bernard Giles so profoundly? He says he had a happy childhood, so it's something he cannot explain.
And I can't address that in one way or the other. I know that for me, it did. That particular genre of fantasy followed me all the way through.
It's a fascination with violence that would lead to even worse.
When I was a child, the films that I enjoyed the most were the monster movies, and I always identified with the monster. He's a good guy at heart, but he tears people's heads off, you know?
When does a killer begin killing? How do his urges get the better of him? The police, still inexperienced in this field, will only slowly uncover what makes a serial killer tick. Did Giles's behavior change over the years? Did his friends think he was becoming a stranger? The police examined Bernard Giles's past, and this man will be one of their main witnesses. Rob English met the boy who would become his best friend in high school.
Eugene didn't seem to be a threat to anybody, and he was just always there. But he would talk to your inside. That's the one thing that I noticed about him. When he talked to me, it was like he was talking to my soul. He wasn't superficial. He was very warm, very sincere, very perceptive, very intelligent. And I can't reiterate enough, even though as shocking as it might sound, he was a nice person to know. I considered him a friend.
Nevertheless, Rob English had no idea, as he was spending time with his friend Bernard Giles, that he was close to committing his first murder.
I knew from the time I was 6 years old that at some point I would become an active murderer. There were instances where I almost did. I almost committed murders one time when I was 16.
On his way home from school, Bernard Giles notices a young woman on an empty road in Titusville. He decides to follow her.
And there was a person, and I basically passed by them, and they just never know how close they came. I mean, it was just at the last moment decision, no, don't do this. And I kept going. I just kept walking. I don't know. I don't know. I just didn't.
The murderer will strike less than 4 years later. In January 1974, the police is faced with an enigma. The statements of all those who knew Bernard Giles didn't add up to someone who could be a killer. But as before, the serial killer was able to fool those closest to him. By a twist of fate, Rob English today lives not far from where some of the bodies had been discovered. To get home, he takes this road, and it makes his spine shiver.
The girl that escaped somewhere in this vicinity right here, on this side of the overpass where he picked her up. But it was over here to the right, over the railroad tracks, where he would leave bodies. Now, up ahead here, these woods here. But you can see that it was in close proximity to the road, but also very, very, very deep woods, and there was nothing out here. But this is where he would place bodies.
Why did he never suspect his friend? It's a question the police asked him, and it still puzzles Rob English to this day. Bernard Giles left high school without a diploma, so is not featured in the school's yearbook. At the time, Rob says his friend's face wouldn't have seemed odd amongst all the other teenagers. The police realize the ability to melt into a crowd is one of the characteristics of serial killers.
After I found out a little bit more about what he did, you know, I'm trying to, because my life paralleled his life. And I went one way, and he went another way. I grew up in the same environment with the same instructors and the same social problems and the same troubles and probably very similar to the same home environment that Eugene Giles did. It's hard to explain how somebody would do some of the things that Eugene allegedly did. It's hard for me to believe, to be honest with you, but maybe if I talked to him now, I would change my mind.
For the killer, his murderous folly seemed to make sense at the time.
I have to internally deal with the fact that to take a person's life, to take everything they would ever be, to do what you do to their family, that is the ultimate act of selfishness. To do that for your own gratification, that momentary gratification, that is the absolute in evil. I understand that. I wish things had gone entirely differently, but they did. You know, I did what I did. I was the person I was.
At the time of his arrest, Bernard Giles is 20 years old. He takes no responsibility for what he did. He will make life difficult for the investigators. He continues to deny he's the Titusville serial killer. Nevertheless, there's a new element that emerges that will force him to change and admit to his first murder. In the attorney's office, a conflict has broken out. The prosecutors are certain that Bernard Giles is guilty and has to pay for his crimes with the loss of his own life. Robert Telfer, the man who discovered the fifth body, is part of the attorney's team. From the very first time he meets the suspect, his mind is made up.
Well, he's a scary-looking guy. Obviously, we're used to, back then, the hippies and that kind of thing. But he had long hair, a beard, and he just had that kind of look that told you something, this could be a guy you didn't want to mess with.
Giles refuses to talk, but police are helped when they uncover a new element. Strands of hair have been found in Giles's car. After examination, the laboratory confirms they belong to Nancy Jerry, one of the victims.
And that's generally the way they do it. They'll charge with one to hold the person, and obviously you won't make bond. But you had all of these other cases that you had to get together with the medical examiner, do all of the medical testing, all of those things which take time. Knew that he'd be someplace where he was never going to get out, never be eligible for parole, never going to see the light of day again.
It's proof that changes everything. Bernard Giles is forced to admit killing Nancy Jerry. He knows he'll have to account for himself before the law. He risks the death penalty.
As a matter of fact, the detectives, they would call you out for interrogations, and they would, frequently, we're going to execute you. You're going to die. And I remember one time that one of them said that, and I just said, yeah, so.
Giles looks destined for the electric chair, but his family rallies round, trying to save him.
I don't think he ever thought I was innocent. He was a staunch supporter of the death sentence. Okay, now he's got a son, his firstborn, who's facing 5 death sentences, right? Radically altered his perspective on the world. He just kept me alive. And truthfully, if he hadn't, I wouldn't be alive. My father went to the Bar Association in Orlando and said, who's your best attorney? Who's the best in the area? And he hired that guy. And my father is a working man. He can't really afford this guy, but he did that.
The famous lawyer hired to save the serial killer's life is Edward Kirkland. Today, he's 92 years old, but clearly remembers the toughest case of his career.
He was there really for no other reason than to try to save his life. That was the thrust of his hiring me, because I made no promises or even held out any hope that I had that curiosity of getting into that case and seeing what I could do.
The struggle between the prosecution and defense is an unequal one. The task facing the defense lawyer seems impossible. Bernard Giles embodies evil. The trial is due to begin in a few weeks, but the attorney is already telling the newspapers that the killer will be tried and executed. Public opinion appears to agree. Even those who knew him are shocked by the assassin who rapes his dead victims.
It's everything he did after, not just the murders, but to revisit the bodies and do unspeakable things. That's something it's just worse than everything. That's what disgusted everyone, in fact.
In addition to being a murderer, Bernard Giles is a necrophiliac. How could this man systematically rape the corpses of his victims?
For a lot of people, it's like people who do serial murders. What it is they're actually serial rapists who are killing their victims. I basically fall into that class. You know, I didn't have to rape a victim. If I did, it was generally after the fact. It's the fact that after he has committed his sexual act of murder, right, that is what gives him the great pleasure. There's a body there. And, you know, naturally it gets used, so.
Rape as a means of extending pleasure after murder. It's a terrible confession, but at the time the experts examining Bernard Giles weren't surprised. Susan Pinto is a psychiatrist specializing in criminal matters. She believes this macabre obsession is fairly typical among most necrophiliac killers.
Some people have sex with a dead body because they found killing the person to be so exciting that they're driven to have sex with the corpse. Or in his case, it's because he objectified the body anyway. I mean, this wasn't a person to him. This was an object for his pleasure and excitement, not a real-life person.
The police discover that in an effort to experience the sensation again, Giles begins returning to the scene of his murders.
And this is part of the reason that I really avoid publicity. Right? He had said that I had come back to sexually revisit the body, right? Okay, that's not a month. That's not even physically possible. You know, I mean, everyone's watched a dog when they've decomposed when we were children. I had gone back to the scene about a month later, and I just wanted to see the state of decomposition of the body.
And this is the man who has to be tried. And yet, astonishingly, the trial of the serial killer will never take place. A few days before the trial was due to start, his lawyer tries a gamble. His aim is to save his client's life and counter the attorney's plans.
He had a good case, but he would stand for no plea bargain in this case in the beginning. I think the police were more interested in solving those other 3 murders than they were in putting him to death. That's the thing that I used to get the death penalty removed.
At the time, Bernard Giles has only confessed to the murder of Nancy Jerry. It's enough to send him to the electric chair, but the police are unable to prove he killed the 4 other young women. The US judiciary system allows for negotiation. Giles's lawyer advises him to plead guilty and confess everything. In exchange for closure on the 5 murder cases, he wants the attorney to drop his demand for the death penalty.
At the day that I was going to begin my first trial, the state came with a deal. And I was glad of it. Not because I was avoiding a death sentence. I didn't, nobody really wants to die, but it wasn't so much that. It was that my family can't afford this lawyer. Yeah, a protracted trial would have ruined my family. So we made a deal.
Paradoxically, to escape the death penalty, Bernard Giles confesses he killed 5 times. He admits to being a serial killer for the first time.
What's your passion? What gets you going? What is the thing in your life that drives you beyond any other thing? For me, it was sexual murder. It was. I mean, you like chocolate because you like chocolate. You can't. You can say you don't like chocolate, but if you like chocolate, you like chocolate.
In August 1974, his lawyer's plan works. The serial killer knows his life will be spared. But tortured by his murderous impulses since childhood, Bernard Giles will still find no peace of mind. On the 13th of August 1974, Bernard Giles appears in court. It's not for trial, but for a simple, negotiated hearing. He pleads guilty to the murders of Paula Hamrick, Nancy Jerry, Sharon Weimer, Carolyn Bennett, and Krista Melton. He's condemned to 5 life sentences with no possibility of remission.
I think he would have continued to do it. He thinks he would have. So maybe it was the best for everything. He got his punishment. Parents and friends of the girls got their closure, and justice was served.
Frankly, as we're supposed to be a somewhat compassionate society, although this tests the limits. He's insane. He's where insane people need to be.
The serial killer will see out the end of his days in this prison in the south of Florida. Almost 40 years after his incarceration, Bernard Giles continues to kill, but virtually. In prison, he's begun drawing. The theme that inspires him is women, naked and being tortured. It's an obsession with death, which makes Bernard Giles one of the most terrifying criminals of recent times. His face still haunts the nightmares of all those who crossed his path. Like Vicky, who managed to escape, and thanks to whom the killer was arrested.
He makes my skin crawl even today looking at him. He looks a lot different than he did then, of course. It's the same cold eyes and cold face that I remember. I would feel better knowing that he'll never, ever see the light of day again if he died, In a way, I would I think he ought to suffer. But he's not. I really hate him, still.
Bernard Giles continues to arouse hate and fear in equal measure. He spent 37 years in jail, and since his arrest, his wife has divorced him. He has no news of her or his daughter. Despite this, to this day, whenever he recalls his crimes, he feels no remorse whatsoever.
I do not hate me. I understand me. And yes, I would want to go back and change things if I could change things, right? But I wouldn't, for who I am right now, I can't think of anybody else I'd rather be than me. I'm at peace with that person, and I wouldn't trade that for anything.